Hi everyone, good morning from DC and welcome to Innovate for Climate. Please mute your audio and turn off your video if you're not one of the speakers. Please participate in our live poll. We would like to know where you're coming from and which sector you're joining us from. Please submit your questions in the WebEx chat box and view the chat panel for helpful information from hosts and panelists regarding the conversation and resources. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on the I4C website. If you're sharing on social media, please use the hashtag #InnovateForClimate. Welcome to Long-Term Strategies as a Tool to Raise Climate Ambition, Experiences from Africa. We're working today in collaboration with climate finance innovators, GIZ, and the government of Germany. And with that, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefan Hoch. I will be your moderator for this event. I'm a director at Perspectives Climate Group and also the lead coordinator of the Climate Finance Innovators project that Isabel has introduced earlier. And now my first task will be to invite our hosts from GIZ, Sven Ekbers, the lead coordinator of the GIZ Global Carbon Markets project based in Kampala, Uganda, to welcome us with his remarks. Sven, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, Stefan. Good morning. Stefan, short microphone check. Is everything working?
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Yeah, perfect. No, good afternoon, everybody, and yeah, also welcome from my side to the webinar on long-term strategies as a tool to raise climate ambition, with a special focus on experiences from Africa. As Stefan mentioned, my name is Sven Ekbers. I work with GIZ in Uganda, where I'm heading the Carbon Markets Promotion Project, which is funded by the German Environment Ministry and which is co-organizing this webinar today in cooperation with our colleagues from the World Bank, the Climate Finance Innovators Project, and Perspectives Climate Group. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank the World Bank for setting up this webinar as part of the virtual Innovate for Climate conference. We, of course, had planned for this event to happen a lot earlier this year, this May in Barcelona. But yeah, for obvious reasons, we had to postpone it to a later date and also, of course, to a different format. But in the end, at least, I think the delay in time also played a bit to our advantage because there have been actually quite a lot of developments in the last 6 months on long-term strategies and where we are benefiting definitely in the webinar today. So far, 19 parties representing 39 countries have completed their long-term strategies. In Africa, actually, Gambia and South Africa have already submitted. But more importantly, other countries, many countries are in the process of developing their strategies, including, for example, the country that I'm currently based in, which is Uganda. Yeah, so this webinar takes a closer look at those developments in Africa. We'll share some country experiences on how African countries have undertaken their LTS process, highlighting the guiding principles and how they have been met on the ground. I really like to keep it brief for the moment, and yeah, without further ado, I once again like to welcome everybody, wish you a very engaging discussion, and I hand it over back to you, Stefan. I think you're still muted, Stefan.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm just finalizing here the settings here. So now you should see the screen in full. Can you just briefly confirm that? Very good. So again,
well, you're in small mode. Previously you were in, now you see 2 slides at the same time.
Okay, then this was probably one time too many. Sorry for that. And now.
Perfect.
Good. So I want to just very quickly today introduce you to our excellent lineup of speakers. They will introduce themselves in more detail, but we'll begin with an overview presentation by Dr. Axel Michaelova, who you already just heard give me some guidance, Research Director and founding partner of Perspectives Group, Climate Group, and Perspectives Climate Research, who will give us an overview of the states of long-term strategies globally and in Africa, and will explain to us what their role is in increasing climate ambition. Then we'll have Mr. Siddharth Pathak, Director of Partnerships at the 2050 Pathways Platform, who will share with us their experience with guiding principles in developing long-term strategies and help us to understand what makes or breaks a good LTS. And then based on these two input presentations, we have a panel discussion in which Ms. Neha Mukhi, a senior climate change specialist at the World Bank, Mr. Bob Matifu from the Climate Change Commission at the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda, as well as Ms. Afif Jafar from the National Agency for Energy and Conservation in Tunisia, will share with us the experience they have made in beginning to develop long-term strategies and share with us some key lessons. We will have the opportunity to engage with questions after that. So if you have questions to the presenters or panelists, please put them in the chat. We'll have a fairly packed agenda, so without any further ado, I will now hand it back over to you, Axel. And that will also mean that I will very briefly switch the presentation here again. But then we are good to go. Can you see Axel's presentation now in full? Axel, can you confirm that?
Okay, I hope you see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Do you see it? Perfect.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Stefan. So I'm looking into now the broader picture with regard to our long-term strategies, low emission development strategies. Actually, I'm using both terms because the terminology unfortunately has not really crystallized so far. Some people talk about LTS, others talk about LEDS. So I'm using both terms interchangeably here. And this graph shows you, of course, the challenge to reach the 1.5 or 2 degree targets of the Paris Agreement, so that globally we would have to reach net zero around 2050 for CO2 and net for all greenhouse gases between 2060 and 2070 if we want to go to 1.5 degrees. So a massive task. And if it's 2 degrees, it's 2 decades later, but still quite challenging. So, of course, on the Paris Agreement, Article 4.19 asks the countries to develop the LTS/LEDS. And the accompanying decision 1CP21 to the Paris Agreement invited parties to submit those strategies to the Secretariat by 2020. And what is important also is that the NDC revision is due also this year. So both the short and the very long-term climate change mitigation strategies have formally to be submitted this year. On the right-hand side, the graph just shows you what actually is the challenge specifically. So we have the process of the NDCs every 5 years updated and probably having a period of 10 years each. And those, of course, then should be developed in line with the overarching long-term strategy until 2050. And of course, these strategies relate both to emission reductions, but also to negative emission uptake through vegetation and other means. So that means the LTS/LEDS is essentially the roof of the national climate change mitigation building, because it is the overarching crystallization of the sequence of NDCs that are to be updated every 5 years. Of course, the NDCs and also the LTS have then both the aspects of mitigation and adaptation. There need to be policies underpinning these pillars. And of course, the whole thing needs to attract financing and be enabled through monitoring, reporting, and verification. So, yeah, very important. But of course, sometimes one doesn't see all parts of this building. So here, this shows you the world map of the officially submitted LTS under the UNFC process. So we have 19 parties that submitted such strategy representing 39 countries because the EU submitted a strategy for the whole regional grouping. So overall, we have a bit more than a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions covered by these LTS. And we have 2 African countries that are engaged. So Benin was the front runner in 2016, and then South Africa joined this year. What I would like to stress is that, of course, many of you have heard about the net zero targets that have been submitted by various countries, and lately this has accelerated. But the set of countries that has such net zero targets is not the same as those countries that have an LTS or LEDS. Because here you have now the list of those countries that have net zero targets. You see that the Nordics are leading there with their target dates. Then we have a group of countries with targets for 2015. And interestingly, in the very last few weeks, we've seen 2 additions from Eastern Asia. And then, of course, we have the big heavyweight China having promulgated such a target also just a month ago for the year 2060. And of course, we haven't seen a Chinese LTS so far. So that brings me to my conclusions, and I would hope that the debate could cover some of these issues. So we have this movement towards the net zero targets, but it's not necessarily reflected in the LTS. One can fairly say that the 2020 deadline for LTS actually was pulverized by the COVID epidemics, and that currently countries strive and struggle to actually achieve the deadline for the NDC revision. So, of course, the resources are really focused there. And I'm involved in various NDC revision processes, and I must confess that in those countries, the LTS doesn't really play an important role. So even a simple cross-reference in the revised NDC to the LTS is sometimes already an uphill struggle. And of course, given the target group of this webinar today, Africa, it is, in my view, extremely important to ensure that the role of international resources, that is also, of course, linked to the conditional character of many African NDCs, should then, of course, inform the LTS with regards to generating long-term stable flows of resources through, for example, the Article 6 market mechanisms and also public climate finance towards Africa. I think it would be really important to now understand also in the African context how this emergence of net zero targets in northern countries, but also eastern countries now could actually then generate demand for Article 6 credits that could then generate significant revenue for African players. For example, just in the context of South Korea, net zero target, a country that's quite active in Africa, at least in the context of CDM POAs. So that would be an entry point for an interesting discussion when now setting up the LTS. So with that, I would like to thank you and pass back to Stefan.
Axel, thank you very much for this extremely concise and compact presentation, which I think gives us all a lot of food for thought. I saw a number of participants joined since we began, so I just want to very quickly repeat that if you have any questions to any of the presenters, please write them down in the chat. We will not unmute mics now in this session today, but you can ask your questions through that function. And with that, I want to hand over to Mr. Siddharth Pathak, who will now explain to us their insights on the guiding principles for developing LTS. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Stefan, and good morning and good afternoon to colleagues. I'm Siddharth. I work for the 2050 Pathways platform, and I'll just share my slide deck. Can you see that now in full screen?
Yes.
Okay, so just so that some people might not know about the 2050 Pathways platform, the 2050 Pathways platform was established at COP16, at COP22, primarily with an intention to support governments who are interested in developing a long-term strategy. The platform basically structurally includes country members, but also works very closely with different organizations like Under 2C40 and We Mean Business, who are supporting similar long-term strategies in regions, cities, and companies. We are working quite closely also with development banks as well as other bilateral donors alongside the UNFCCC in order to support the different countries that are undertaking their long-term strategy. Primary modus operandi for the platform is obviously to support from a financial perspective, but also to sort of create partnerships amongst countries so that they can share and exchange on knowledge. Now, coming to the long-term strategy, as Axel already sort of talked about, 19 countries to date have already submitted their long-term strategies. We're expecting 50 plus by COP26. If you are actually looking at the big emitters, or most of the G20 countries are already in preparation of their long-term strategies and should be submitting their strategies in course of the next year towards COP26, now that the deadline is sort of fluid because of the COVID crisis. If you look at the sort of spread of long-term strategies and the strategies that are under preparation, you can see most of Asia is well covered. I think there are big gaps in Central Asia, Africa, and West Asia. And obviously, there are some countries in South America, like Brazil, that are not, for the time being, undertaking any long-term strategy as such. In terms of Africa, there are obviously Benin as well as South Africa that have submitted their long-term strategies, but the ones under preparation right now are Morocco, the Gambia, Uganda, and you'll hear from the representative from Uganda later, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been repeated, but it's basically 6 or 7 countries that are undertaking the long-term strategy for the time being on the African continent. Now, if you flip the map to a different perspective, which is on net zero emissions and targets towards net zero, which are obviously the talk of the town these days in the climate community, there are the big players like China who have just announced their sort of commitment to net zero. But there've also been announcements at the previous COP from the Climate Ambition Alliance that are actually where a lot of African countries have committed to net zero emissions or to develop long-term strategies as part of being in the least developed country grouping, or they have sort of signed up to the Climate Ambition Alliance at the previous COP. So there is, if I go back to the map, there is actually an interesting sort of interplay where a lot of the countries that have committed to net zero emissions at the previous COP aren't necessarily for the time being undertaking a long-term strategy, and it's not very clear how those commitments are going to be realized. In terms of sort of key principles of the long-term strategy, you basically have to look at like 5 big pieces. The first one is, what is the underlying vision for your long-term strategy? The long-term strategy is not necessarily an NDC, which is to be agreed in the UNFCCC system. Long-term strategy is meant to be a statement of purpose for your country to transform towards the mid-century and actually showcase how that transformation is going to be undertaken. The vision, or the sort of backbone of the long-term strategy, is actually a vision towards 2050. And I think what distinguishes a LEDS from a long-term strategy is primarily the time frame, where you're actually looking at mid-century and beyond, versus the LEDS that were sort of coming up from the Cancun Agreement, looking at 2030 or the shorter time frame. But the vision in itself would be quite critical to actually sort of elaborate on how the country imagines itself in the future. The vision should obviously not just include the climate sort of dimension of it, but also the socio-economic development aspect of the country, And that's extremely critical because as you're looking at net zero emissions or as you're looking at sort of decarbonizing the economy, it's equally important to sort of look at the development imperatives in the country and see how the two interplay. So a big part of how long-term strategies will be gauged is based on how sort of robust this vision towards 2050 is. The next bit is obviously scenarios and modeling. There is scenarios towards your emission trajectory that need to be developed in the long-term strategy. Obviously, the robustness of these scenarios, the underlying data and assumptions that are being made would obviously be important, but how these scenarios are underpinning climate science, like Axel had shown earlier, is very important. If you are showing that you're decarbonizing only by the end of the century, clearly there is a bit of a mismatch between what your sort of intentions are versus what the climate science tends to dictate in terms of when the world needs to decarbonize. The sort of third bit that's equally important is the stakeholder engagement. And by this, I don't just mean having stakeholder consultations with non-state actors, but how embedded is the process of long-term strategy in the country, whether it's being carried out from a whole of government approach and a whole of society approach, as well as whether there is enough buy-in of the long-term strategy and the vision across the country in itself. So the stakeholder engagement is quite critical because when we are looking at taking decisions in the future for the large sort of populace, we need to sort of ensure that people are on board some of the ideas that might be radical or that might be transformative and have an impact and effect on their lives and livelihoods. So having a stakeholder engagement process that is consistent and not just a one-off during the process of development on the long-term strategy is another key element that one needs to look at. The fourth one is obviously connected to the NDCs and other sort of policy frameworks. So it's not just the NDCs that are important, but also other development planning processes that might be running in your country for a time frame of 10 years or 5 years, or depending on how different countries work. But having a clear set of policies that trigger the transformation that you're looking at in 2050 is very important to show in the long-term strategy. This policy framework obviously will be more detailed in the near future, probably a little more detailed in the medium future, and very sort of indicative for the longer sort of future in itself. So you probably can think of it in 3 sort of decadal windows where you're looking at 2030, 40, and 50, and the sort of policies that you envision to have in the country in these sort of decades. And this policy framework is what will really underpin the implementation of the long-term strategy alongside the NDC and alongside other policy frameworks that might be applicable in the country. And lastly, because we are looking at 3 decades of time horizon, nobody can be sure how 3 decades will look like. And so there are a lot of assumptions that will be updated and questioned over a period of time. Technology will catch up. There will be new technology and new sort of innovations that could be leveraged. So the long-term strategy needs to be a sort of a living document, which has an embedded revision cycle in it. And if you see some of the countries that have submitted the long-term strategy early on, they're likely to revise their long-term strategies in the coming year or so. So it's important to sort of think of this long-term strategy as an evolving document that takes into account the different developments that are happening in the country as well as outside, and how that sort of correlates to the trajectory in the country in itself. Now, very quickly on the net zero part of it, and because many African countries are committed to a net zero target for the time being, it's important to sort of think of net zero from different perspectives. If you look at the current strategies that are submitted or in the making, if there are different approaches how countries have accounted for their net zero commitment. In Costa Rica, Portugal, New Zealand, Marshall Islands, they're looking at a more backcasting approach where net zero is a hard target, and that is the target that the government is trying to achieve through different scenarios that they're planning for in terms of their sort of development and in terms of the economic sort of shape of the country in itself. Then there are countries like Fiji, Slovakia, European Union that have looked at net zero as part of multiple scenarios. So they're looking at different ways in which net zero could be achieved. So they've not given a definitive pathway, but they've actually given multiple scenarios which they could undertake in order to get to net zero emissions. And then there are countries like Japan, Singapore, and this includes South Africa as well, where they have talked about a net zero objective as an aspiration, They've talked about net zero as an objective that they'll probably want to reach, but haven't necessarily underpinned that objective with clear scenarios or clear trajectories. That is yet to be defined, and that's something that's still sort of ambiguous in their long-term strategies, where they're sort of looking at net zero as more of an aspirational target instead of a very clear target that they're sort of aligning their or calibrating their existing policies towards. There are a lot of resources that you could sort of.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you
Yes.
wrap it up in 1 minute?
Yes.
Thank you.
Actually, in 30. So there are lots of resources out there that you could access that will give you a sense of what are the different elements of a long-term strategy. But like I said, I think there are the 5 elements that one needs to be very conscious of when you're actually developing the long-term strategy, because the external world, as well as a lot of financial institutions, are looking at those 5 elements to actually gauge whether your long-term strategy is viable as well as investable in a way where they could actually direct their finances and resources towards it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. So now we have received a lot of food for thought on the conceptual level and on the global overview level with regards to how that is relevant for Africa. And now I would like to open up the panel discussion, beginning with Ms. Neha Mukhi, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank, who will share with us how the World Bank supports countries in Africa in developing their long-term strategies and what the experiences so far have been. Neha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for the excellent presentations so far. In terms of the World Bank engagement on long-term strategies, first and foremost, I would like to highlight some of the recent work, the thinking that is being informing our engagement on long-term strategies. This is mostly around the World Bank Outlook 2050 initiative that was initiated last year and was completed and launched earlier this year in June, which basically looks at how the World Bank can support countries on long-term decarbonization and development goals together. And as part of this work, some of the key sort of messages that emerged is that there has been a lot of sort of sectoral action on climate change that has been scaling up in the recent years. But at the same time, the scale and pace of action that is needed to meet the climate goals has, it needs to be ramped up even more if we're to realistically meet the goals we have so far. And as we know that the NDCs collectively are not ambitious enough to meet those goals. So with that sort of challenge in mind, the Outlook 2050 initiative came together to inform the thinking on how we could do that. And the main sort of recommendations that came out of this is that we should be looking at a 2-level engagement, bottom up, looking at cross-sectoral actions that sort of leverage synergies across sectors, and we can also not just focus on mitigation, but deliver adaptation benefits as well. So we're talking energy systems, water systems, urban environments, transport systems, mobility, delivering mobility, digital systems for that matter. But all of this needs to be complemented by another level of action, the top-down action, which involves central planning agencies, ministries of finance and financial sector to integrate climate into macroeconomic planning, fiscal planning, into national budget frameworks, into financial sector policies and incentives, and overall systems level approach to economy-wide planning. And this top level is where the bank is working to scale up its support to countries on, while we're continuing with our support on the sectoral and cross-sectoral actions on climate. So some of the recent work that is, that we've been supporting in the region includes things like integrating climate into national budget frameworks, also supporting financial sector in the countries on stress testing, on integrating transition risks to assess stability, financial stability of these sectors. But all of this ideally should be embedded into risk-informed macro-fiscal planning. And that's where we're still seeing some of the gaps. For example, there's not enough experience or tools right now to support that. And this work we've been supporting in other regions, but in the Africa region, we're just starting to build that work. Just as some examples, in South Africa, we're supporting work on climate budget tagging that can inform future budget planning exercises and budget allocation towards climate action. Similarly, we're looking at how to support countries on specific sectors, specific financial stress testing for the financial institutions, and both looking at from public sector finance and the private sector financing perspective. Now, this is sort of our approach globally and has been trickling down into regional action. But just recently, the World Bank in September had launched the next generation of Africa Climate Business Plan that prioritizes efforts around food security, clean energy, and similar sort of top very specific priority areas that are super relevant and critical for Africa. But at the same time, recognizing the gap that I had also highlighted earlier, there is a special emphasis on risk-informed macroeconomic policies and on delivering green and resilient infrastructure. And these are the two sort of special emphasis areas that have emerged as part of bank engagement, as a forward-looking areas for bank engagement in the Africa region, to be supported through technical assistance and investment financing. I'll take a pause there and turn it over back to you. Stefan, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I'd only shown back my video. Thank you very much, Neha, for this very rich and at the same time punctual contribution. I'm sure we can come back to that in the discussion. Thank you so much. For now, let me please invite Mr. Bobna Tifu, Commissioner at the Climate Change Department at the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda. Please, Bob, can I please ask you to share some experiences and lessons that you have made in the LETS preparation in Uganda? Maybe you can share with us some success factors and maybe also some of the pitfalls that you have encountered now in this process. The floor is yours. Bob, we cannot hear you yet.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was still muted. I thought everything.
No, it's excellent. Now very well.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Good afternoon, colleagues from Kampala. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to be a part of this conversation, and I'd really like to thank GIZ for this opportunity and the continuous support they render to the government of Uganda, not only on the LTS, but on so many other climate actions that we take forward. All the speakers from the start, I think up to now, have tried to emphasize and trying to refresh our minds of what the LTS is all about. But nonetheless, I'll also start my input by reminding ourselves what this LTS is all about. And we all know that it is just like the NDC. These are just tools that we use to raise climate ambition within the realms of our common but differentiated responsibilities. But primarily for LTS, as you've heard already from the start, is that here we're looking at carbon neutrality by mid-century, but also move towards net zero at the end of the century. Now, from our experience, the questions then we ask ourselves, if you're talking about LTS, how do we get there? Let's look at our national aspirations. The Vision 2040, and I think it is, I think Stefan or the previous speaker who talked about national aspirations. The Vision 2040 of our country speaks to transforming our society from a peasantry to a modern and prosperous country within the 30 years, and ultimately attaining middle income status within that time frame. But the country's vision, as you've clearly seen, can actually, the Vision 2040 envisages to be achieved through harnessing opportunities in agriculture, tourism, oil and gas, minerals, and so on and so forth. But we're looking at space. These are the same sectors that actually we point to in terms of increasing emissions and the one responsible for our emission profiles. So it becomes a bit very, very complicated how to delink these two dilemmas. The dilemma of ensuring that you reduce emissions on one part, as the LTS points out, but also the dilemma on ensuring that you continue with economic development or you improve individual livelihood and well-being of the people. But having said that, so as a background, there are challenges that we've experienced, even if you take just that one bit alone as one of the challenges that we are faced with. I've framed the challenges on two fronts. One is the process-oriented challenges. Process-oriented challenges speaking to things like, how does this whole process fit into the national policy development process, the LTS process that we've started amidst the COVID challenges that we're faced with? Because we are coming up with a policy document, questions are going to arise. What is the scale of consultation? But not merely consultation as it comes as the word, but how confident and how strong has the input been from across all the different stakeholders to warrant this to be a national policy document. That also leads to the whole idea of the general acceptance, because we are talking about transforming the economy from what it is into helping Uganda apply or respond in a carbon neutral world. So there's some kind of transformational shift that is required to change the things the way we are doing now to a world that is not so much known or familiar to developing nations like Uganda. Now that's on one front in terms of process-oriented challenges. But there are also challenges I have framed as practical realities. Once we have finished with these processes and we have the LTS approved, how then do we move forward? About three things. One, there are data and information requirements that we need actually to come up with a robust long-term strategy that we have to deal with. For example, we may require resource extraction data. We may require socioeconomic indicators for us to be able to come up with a meaningful long-term strategy that actually speaks to the national aspirations that are put forward. And then, of course, not forgetting the science-driven requirements that actually should speak to the dynamics of net zero or the dynamics of no emissions at all as we move into the close of the century. But having said that, there are also opportunities that we see in undertaking this long-term strategy process. Let's think about, again, the idea that all the strategies that we are trying to develop are trying to help us move from the business that we've been conducting for the last so many years to some kind of carbon neutrality moving forward. So the question that comes to our part as a country, what does carbon neutrality mean to the development aspirations that we've set ourselves, for example, in the Vision 2040? What do we think about, for example, the jobs at risk or the assets at risk that we are so heavily dependent on in terms of socioeconomic development to what the LTS, for example, will put forward in terms of moving to a carbon neutral world? And ultimately, how then do we prepare ourselves for an economy that will emerge in a carbon neutral world as Uganda? So we see those as opportunities where we're going to put ourselves to these questions and see how best they can be responded to. And we see LTS providing that opportunity for us to respond to that, to those key questions, but also help us come up with meaningful strategies that we think will help us survive in a carbon neutral world. So those are the few insights that I thought I would share, and I'm happy to pick it up beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for sharing with us some insights both on the process and these strategic considerations that you just ended on. I think these are absolutely crucial. And I would just invite one more time the audience to post their questions in the chat. We'll have now one final, last but certainly not least, presentation or panel contribution by Ms. Afif Jafar from Tunisia. And she will share experiences now from Tunisia, where a similar process has been already underway for some time. So we are very much looking forward to hearing from you, and then we'll open it up for questions that we can hopefully receive in the chat until then. Afif, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Hello, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some insights on the Tunisian experience regarding long-term strategies, but also how the long-term strategies can play a role in raising climate ambitions. So as it has been said at the beginning, according to Article 6, all the countries are called upon to submit their long-term strategies. And for the Tunisian case, Tunisia intends to submit its long-term climate strategy to the UNFCCC by 2021. It was supposed to be submitted in 2020, but regarding the COVID crisis, it was postponed to 2021. So in Tunisia, we have opted to both work on mitigation and adaptation to develop a national long-term low-emission and climate resilient strategy. The study has started recently, and we had the first national workshop just last week. On the other hand, given that the energy sector has the biggest mitigation potential, we started the last year working on the low carbon strategy, but it was specific to the energy sector. This work on the energy sector is still undergoing and will be the base of the national low carbon strategy. This work on the energy sector, as I said, is undergoing, and it will be used, and the lessons learned from the energy sector will be very useful for the national strategy. We are going to use the same approach, and the results related to the energy sector will be reflected in the national strategy through a compilation work. So let me share with you the approach taken to conduct the work on local carbon strategy in the energy sector in Tunisia. It was planned in 3 phases. The first phase to set a global vision for the energy sector that fulfills both energy, economy, social, and climate purposes. And then develop the socioeconomic scenario and energy scenarios, business as usual and low carbon scenarios. The second phase was the simulation of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 based on the economic and energy scenarios that were prepared in the first phase. And then the third phase includes macroeconomic modeling to assess the impact of the low carbon strategy on socioeconomic aspects, and also a roadmap for implementation of the strategy. So to that end, we created a steering committee to supervise the outlines of the work conducted. We also created 5 working groups. The first one to work on the socioeconomic scenario, since there is no official one by 2050. So for the modeling needs, we were obliged to build one. And 4 other sectoral working groups to build the energy scenarios. It was a bit challenging but at the same time, very interesting to have all the stakeholders on board. So based on a wide-ranging consultation process and according to the first simulation results, Tunisia hopes to achieve 80% reduction in carbon intensity in the energy sector by 2050, compared with 2010 carbon intensity levels. The main pillars to achieve the 2050 vision in the energy sector are the energy efficiency and renewable energy, with two ambitious goals of increasing the share of renewable energy up to 80% in electricity production by 2050, and reducing the energy intensity by an average of 4% per year. Besides the energy efficiency and renewable energy targets, other paths were explored in order to raise climate ambition, such as moving to a different economic structure by 2050, based on higher added value sectors with lower energy content. We should, for example, switch towards a service economy. Focusing on energy sobriety, which is always left behind or omitted despite its important role in reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, mainly through behavioral and lifestyle changes. And the electrification of final users, which should not be limited to the transport sector, but also to the industrial and residential sectors. So maybe given the time constraints, I cannot go into more detail, so I gave a brief overview on the results achieved so far. What we are doing now, we are currently working on the impact assessment of the low carbon strategy through a macroeconomic model called FUI, which is a model used in France to assess the impact of the low carbon energy transition in France, and we will be preparing the implementation of the roadmap shortly. So maybe to summarize, I think that the main levers to achieve these ambitious mitigation targets are wide-ranging stakeholder consultation. Governance is also essential to ensure that national policies are in line with the strategy. And carbon pricing, which is also one of the key climate policies to give price signal to move towards the most efficient low-carbon technologies. So before closing, I will go back to the national low-carbon strategy. We are going to use the same approach as for the energy sector, the same socioeconomic scenario, and the same base year in order to be able to conduct the compilation work and to ensure coherence between all the sectors. So thank you very much for your attention, and of course I will be at your disposal if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much also to you, Afif, for giving again a very detailed input in a short time. And thank you, all of you, for now a really, really disciplined and very smooth delivery of your inputs. I think this is great because it gives us enough time to now consider the questions from the audience, from which we have now received a number of questions. I would like to start with Bob, because we have now several questions addressed to Uganda specifically, and then we have a number of questions to all panelists. I will now read those out to you. And then, Bob, you can go at it first, and the others can also come in afterwards. And in the meantime, we would still encourage the audience to include further questions in the chat. We may have time for a second round before closing. So, Bob, the first question in the chat, you may have seen that, but I read it for the audience. Your submission suggests that the challenge lies in innovative alternatives across the development sectors. Do you have a roadmap for the strategic assessment of innovative alternatives across sectors? So that's the first question from Moses, and the second one specifically to Uganda from Miguel. Uganda already has a RED+ strategy and is already receiving climate finance. Would it make sense to use this strategy to develop the LTS for Uganda? So these are specific to Uganda. I'll still read out the general questions to all panelists so that you can prepare for it, and Bob can consider to also address those if you wish. To all panelists, from Axel, in fact, how can one ensure that the LTS becomes a relevant policy design instrument and not a theoretical modeling exercise? Then there's a second question to all panelists. My question from Raymond: how do we ensure sustainable financing for LTS? Thank you, GIZ, for the forum. And then there's also one question that now came in specifically addressed to Siddharth, but we'll park that for now and make sure we have enough time to go to it. But Bob, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. The question I'm responding to is on the REDD+. You'll help me with the second one. I didn't hear it very clearly. First, I think the understanding that if you look at the NDC, for example, because sometimes it's hard to discuss these things in isolation. The emission profiles that we have actually goes beyond forestry as it is. What we have in the NDC for now, we talk about wetlands, land use change, and forestry, which are like the key sectors where we are recording high emissions. But when we look at moving forward, we also see other aspects like issues on transport coming in and issues on waste, which is a very potential entrant into the next submission that we are going to make. So looking at REDD+ strategy alone, I think will negate the impact of the contribution of other sectors in terms of helping Uganda reach the net zero ambition that we are looking out for. Considering the fact that REDD+ mainly focuses on forestry, then it will be a bit of disservice when we talk about all the other sectors that I've raised. But also, having said that on forestry, if you remember the key aspiration that I noted for the country, transforming a country from a peasantry to a middle-income country, that calls for ensuring that we include more sectors beyond forestry, because as you heard already, we are looking at exploring sectors like oil and gas. But so how is that going to be done and to reach net zero if we negate the oil and gas sector in the LTS and merely focusing on land use change and forestry? So, but also the most important thing is the aspect of adaptation in our long-term strategies. Because we define ourselves as an adaptation-first country, so we want to take this as an opportunity to ensure that adaptation continues to be prominent in all the strategies that we enlist if we are to attain the economic development path that we have aspired to achieve in the national aspirations that we've pointed out to. So that is to the question from the colleague in Benin. I'm sorry I didn't hear clearly the other question, but maybe you'll remind me, or I can look it up myself.
Yeah, sorry, Bob. I think my moderator device with which I tried to monitor time interrupted there a bit. But I think you actually covered it already, because the question was, on alternative across different sectors and whether there's a roadmap for the strategic assessment of innovative alternatives across sectors. And I think you already alluded now quite nicely to cross-sectoral considerations. So if you just want to take that very, very briefly, because we're out of time. If you want to add anything, then that's fine. But otherwise, I would suggest let's hand over also to the other panelists in order to give them a chance to respond.
No, I'll give a chance to other panelists. That's fine.
Yeah, I think it's covered, as I mentioned. Thank you. So who would like to come in? Afif, would you like to respond to the country level? And then we can have Neha also maybe share from the World Bank perspective. Afif, please.
Thank you. So maybe regarding the question on how to ensure that long-term strategy becomes relevant policy design, actually it's a challenge. It's, I think, one of the main challenges. That's why at the end of my speech I said that we need to ensure that national policies are in line with the strategy. For example, in Tunisia, we are currently preparing for the 5-year economic development plan now for 2021 to 2024. And we are doing our best to include all the scenarios that have been developed under the long-term strategy, and also what we are going to do under the NDC update in the economic development plan, at least for the five next years. So it's really a challenge. And maybe also regarding the question, how do we ensure sustainable financing for long-term strategies? I think, in my opinion, when you develop your long-term strategy, at the beginning, you should not look at the financial constraints. Because you need to have a vision, you need to have an ambitious vision, and then try to build the most effective scenario to reach this vision, and then look for the financial support that will be needed to attain this strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then among the questions to our panelists, we have the ensuring how we ensure sustainable financing for LTS. And I think, Neha, since you already talked about the role of financial institutions also quite a bit in your presentation, maybe that's something that you can address. And then afterwards, I would also like to already hand over to Siddharth for the final question. In practical terms, what different work on scheduling of tasks is required for a backcasting approach relative to a forecasted scenario approach? I guess for the former, a firm goal is needed first, but in the latter, the goal can be agreed later. So Neha, maybe on the financing aspects first, also on the others if you wish, and then Siddharth on the more technical methodological question.
Thank you, Stefan. I think our speakers, both from Uganda and Tunisia, actually covered it very well and very eloquently in terms of these two strategies cannot afford to be separate. Development strategies and long-term strategies cannot be two separate strategies, because we'll spend the rest of the implementation time trying to reconcile these. So in terms of the work that's emerging, what's very clear is these need to be aligned and to the best possible extent be integrated. So the point on starting with risk-informed macroeconomic planning that further informs development plans, budget frameworks across for the entire country, for the economy. I think starting with that fundamental point has been could lead to sort of avoiding those issues. So that's one point to align development strategies and long-term strategies. Second point in terms of sustainable financing, I think overall, whether it is already for sustainable development goals, the financing needs are so high that we know public finance alone, including development finance, cannot meet those investment needs. So we need to, through innovative ways, leverage public finance to attract private sector finance to boost these investments in long-term strategies that are more sustainable in future, and also reduce the burden on public finances in the sectors where it is possible, at least. And for that reason, the risk-based approach for both individual investment planning and program planning, and integrating climate risks, both physical and transition risks, into the policies and regulations that enable private sector to internalize this as part of their own risk, because it is a risk to their bottom line at the end of the day. They may not be internalizing it, but creating frameworks and incentives for private sector to internalize these transition and physical risks will enable investments to be channeled into areas that are aligned with the development and long-term strategy goals. So that would be the way to crowd in finance that makes investments sustainable going forward.
Thank you so much. And then Siddharth, maybe also really quite quickly, because we have another final question that I'd like to take after your intervention. Thanks, Siddharth.
Sure. I think in terms of the backcasting approach or the forecasting approach, I don't think there's any problem with choosing a target later. I think it's only a matter of the bigger problem is that until unless you actually hold the climate sort of target or net zero target as a constant constraint. The other sort of variables will move the modeling a lot more if it's not considered as a static constraint. I think the other big sort of problem is that if you're forecasting things, there is a higher chance of you to actually get trapped into an incremental sort of policy approach versus a more transformative approach, because some of the options, like in the case of gas, become viable in the short term if you're forecasting, while in a sort of a net zero backcasting approach, that option completely goes out of the table.
Thank you for responding quite concisely here. So the last question that we can take now before closing the webinar is from Frida Mikulczak from BMU, the German Environment Ministry. How can national long-term strategies and the international community more broadly better account for developments in regional or global demand and related outsourcing of greenhouse gas emissions? For instance, increase in demand for fossil fuels in Southern Africa, driven by demand in the US, China, EU countries. Same relates to global agriculture value chains and related land use change, such as deforestation and palm oil or soy production in Indonesia, Brazil, to meet consumer demand in these countries. Who would like to take that question?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, please go for it.
Thanks, Stefan. So I think thanks, Frida, for that question. And it'll be interesting to see some of the upcoming long-term strategies, because countries like Argentina, Indonesia, and even Turkey are starting to consider some of these questions in their long-term strategy, especially in light of the EU Green Deal discussions, as well as the recent net zero announcements from Japan, China, and South Korea. A lot of the countries are in their long-term strategies taking into account some of these trade implications in light of their long-term trajectories as well, not necessarily with respect to the outsourcing bit, but definitely the trade question in light of what they're producing for the world, which is sort of going to net zero, is a pretty sort of center stage discussion in some of these discussions that we are part of. And I think another long-term strategy like South Africa, you could actually look at the strategy to see some of those issues around trade starting to pop up in the text of the long-term strategy. So it's happened. Unfortunately, the earlier long-term strategies were too modeling centric and did not take into account some of these qualitative sort of discussions. But in the upcoming ones, you'll see some of these dimensions in the long-term strategy.
Okay, thank you so much. Any additional very final responses? That is not the case. Then, Isabel, I would hand it back to you and thank all of you, to the presenters and panelists, for your very insightful contributions. I think we all learned a lot. And Isabel, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And again, this session has been recorded and it will be available on the I4C website. Thank you for joining us today.